Us when it's Welcome to Blush to Bloom. My name's Madeleine de Hawk, and I have with me Professor Peter Drummond, and we're going to have a conversation about the fear of blushing. So, Professor Drummond, welcome, Professor Drummond. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Madeleine.
Professor Drummond is the Professor of Psychology at Murdoch University in Australia. His focus and his area of expertise is the psycho-physiology behind blushing, and he's going to share with us what that is, and also the brain science around blushing, how we feel, how we think around chronic blushing. And we're just going to have a chat together about some of the reasons of behind blushing, what causes blushing, or at least some ideas around that, and also what some insights that can help people who suffer with chronic blushing to manage their blushing and eventually move past their blushing. So welcome, Professor Drummond. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
And so perhaps we could start off by sort of understanding what got you into this subject, because when you suffer with chronic blushing, I suffered with chronic blushing 20 years ago now, but for decades. And at the time, at least, there was very little information. And even now, there's very little information about chronic blushing. So it's wonderful to find somebody that's actually interested in researching it. What got you into this subject in the first place?
Well, it was an indirect sort of entry into studying blushing. But when I was a PhD student, I was interested in what was the driving mechanisms of migraine headache.
Right.
And at the time, migraine headache was thought to be a vascular response, a response in the blood vessels of the head, that the blood vessels of the head dilated, and this created a headache. And in part, that still runs true today. But one of the studies that I was involved in was to try to tease out what was driving this vascular response in migraine sufferers, what made their blood vessels dilate. And our theory was that the sympathetic nervous system may be involved. And so what we did to investigate this idea was to find people who had had an injury to the nerves that supply the blood vessels of the face. We studied their response to things that would make those blood vessels dilate, including body heating, including certain types of spicy foods, which were known to make people flush. But being a psychology PhD student, I thought that it would also be interesting to use an emotional trigger to see whether the sympathetic nerves to the blood vessels of the face were responsible for the reddening of the face when people blush. So that's how I became interested in it. I myself am a blusher, as is almost the entire world population. But I considered at the time that I was blushing quite strongly. It didn't concern me. It probably was a point of interest for other people who could judge my emotions by the colour of my face, but so be it. But that was an additional reason for me to see whether I could find out more about what was producing this, this physiological response, what I call a psycho-physiological response, a psychological stimulus producing a change in the body's physiology.
Fantastic. So you had migraines and you were researching that, and you were also a blusher. So when you were researching migraines and the vasodilation, the dilation of the blood vessels to the face, and that potential connection with your migraines, you also thought, oh, well, maybe I can figure out my blushing as well.
That's right.
That's wonderful. Actually, I studied medicine because I wanted to understand my blushing. I wanted to figure it out. So it's nice
Mm,
to be able to figure it out. And so you you talk about the psychology, so the emotions and the way we think and feel about
mm,
our blushing, as well as the physiology, so the way the body actually responds.
mm.
To our thoughts. Is that right when you talk about psychophysiology?
Yes, that's what we mean when we, being the community of psychologists who study physiological reactions in people, we call this discipline psychophysiology.
Mm-hmm. So, what did you find out? Because you wrote with some other wonderful researchers, you wrote a really great paper, which is how I found you, and that was in 2020 about the treatment options for the fear of blushing.
Mm,
And not only was I really interested in, because treatment options, so everybody wants to know, everybody who suffers with chronic blushes wants to know, how can I treat this? But also I was very attracted by the title, because it wasn't treatment options for blushing, it was treatment options for the fear of blushing.
mm,
And in your paper, you talk a lot about the anxiety behind the blushing. So it's not so much the blushing that's the issue, it's the anxiety behind that. Um,
mm.
would you like to talk to that for us for a moment?
Yes, well, blushing, as I was saying before, is a normal physiological reaction. We all blush, uh, some of us more visibly than others. It depends a lot upon whether that blush is seen as to the color of our skin.
Mhm.
People with fair skin um, uh, blush more easily, if we think of blushing as reddening of the face, than people with darker skin. But that's not really a problem. People flush when they exercise, people flush in the heat, people flush when they eat certain foods, people flush when they drink alcohol. We're not frightened of flushing in those circumstances, but many people are anxious about blushing in social situations, about the emotions that trigger the blushing response in particular.
Mhm.
And so they sometimes get to the point of avoiding social situations that they might otherwise enjoy because they're frightened of blushing. And so under these circumstances, that fear then does become a problem because it is inhibiting our activities. We're not able to do what we would like to do and feel comfortable while we're doing those things.
Absolutely. You mentioned that you used to blush when you were a young PhD student, but it didn't really bother you. And you said, other than the fact that people could see your underlying emotions. And
mm,
as an ex-blusher myself and working with blushers, it's absolutely that. It's the feeling that your body is betraying you. Your body is showing how you feel inside. It's almost like you have no control over your body. It's a betrayal. And
mm,
that can be very, very painful. I remember absolutely avoiding social situations, avoiding interviews for jobs or universities, completely hiding and avoiding things because of the fear that I might blush. And I
mm.
know that lots of people feel the same. So luckily for you, when you were that age, it didn't, you didn't have that fear connection with it. But
No.
once that fear connection comes, it's a hard thing to manage.
Yeah, so it becomes a phobia. We talk about fear of blushing as being erythrophobia or fear
Hmm.
of redness.
Yeah.
Um, and that then does become a problem if uh, people are frightened of doing things that they otherwise would enjoy doing. Um, and I think it is an important point to make that blushing itself is not a problem, but being frightened of blushing can be a problem.
Mhm.
And that then should direct the way that we try to help people who are frightened of blushing. We should be focusing on helping them overcome their fear, rather than helping them to hide blushing.
Yeah, yeah, and maybe a little bit of both, because if they can find the right kinds of creams, or they can get the right kind of, I call them crutches, crutches
Yes.
to help you. Because I know, for example, during COVID, everybody wore a mask. And so that was kind of a crutch. People felt more confident because they could hide
Mm,
behind their mask. And that
mm,
maybe allowed them to go out and do things which they wouldn't have done.
mm.
But then if you're dependent on the mask, then that's the crutch. You need to be able to let go of your crutches over time.
That's true.
So it's such an important point. Yeah.
Mm. In terms of psychological treatments, if we think of blushing or fear of blushing as a simple phobia, and in some people, they're primarily concerned about blushing. They're not concerned about social situations more broadly, but just about blushing in
Hmm.
that situation. And we could then consider that fear of blushing as being what's called a simple phobia. And back in, well, when I did do my undergraduate psychology, I learnt a little bit about clinical management of fears. And back in the old days, when I was a student, the primary form of treating simple phobias or simple fears was a process of systematic desensitization, either in imagination or in real life. And this involved creating a hierarchy of feared situations and then working steadily through that hierarchy. So for somebody with the fear of blushing, it would be important not to go too quickly through
Yes.
that hierarchy, to take simple, gentle steps
Yeah.
toward the target that you're working towards, um, to help to build self-confidence. And so I think that it might be useful for somebody who is frightened of blushing to have a means of being able to manage their anxiety before then moving on to the next step. But then, as you say, letting go of any aids or crutches that they're using to manage their anxiety as they become more confident.
I've never heard it described as a simple fear as opposed to a more complex one.
Mm,
And certainly for me, when I was learning about phobias in medical school, and I applied the same sort of principles to myself, when I was then in the professional situation, my biggest problem was speaking up in meetings.
mm,
And so what I did is what you've described. My first goal was to be able to clear my throat. I wasn't even trying to speak up, because even that, for me, I would blush and get all sort of anxious about doing that. So
mm,
that was my goal, just to be able to do that. And then
mm,
once I could do that, my next goal was to, maybe it was before online meetings, obviously. The next goal was to be able to stand up and go and get a drink of water or a piece of fruit from the bowl or something and come back,
mm,
not say anything. So I gave myself these little targets until
mm,
eventually I could perhaps agree with something that somebody said, maybe
mm,
ask somebody a question, and then little by little be able to say what I thought in a meeting. So those small hierarchies, as you've said,
mm,
that's such a
mm,
helpful way of looking at it.
mm, mm.
And how does that compare then to more complex fears associated with blushing? Do you have any sense of that?
Yeah, well, blushing is part of what's called social anxiety disorder. Not everybody with social anxiety disorder has a fear of blushing. Not everybody um, with a fear of blushing has social anxiety disorder, but they do overlap.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the anxiety that people have in social situations is a little more complex than simply being frightened of the colour of your face. They're often frightened of uh, attention being drawn to themselves. They're frightened of being evaluated in a negative way by others. They're frightened of being ridiculed or rejected by other people. And they then need to find strategies to help them feel more comfortable in social situations. One of the less effective strategies for people with these types of anxieties is to avoid social situations. They become reclusive.
Yeah.
And that is quite a different form of anxiety than the anxiety that people might experience if they worry that they're going to feel a little silly if their face turns red.
Mm-hmm. So the idea is if you're a chronic blusher and you find you also do suffer from that social anxiety, you've got two avenues to help yourself. One is the simple fear of blushing, as you've described it, and that hierarchy of fears, and just start at the bottom of the ladder. Don't start too high. And then in the more complex social environment situation, about helping yourself feel more comfortable in those social events. So people I work with, for example, having a coffee in a coffee house, or going to a restaurant with friends, or if it's Father's Day or Mother's Day or a wedding, and they know there's going to be people there, they get very worried, that anticipatory anxiety before the event, and then there's the event. Do you have any thoughts on how people can help themselves feel less anxious in those social situations?
Well, that's a little bit out of my area of expertise, but there is a treatment for people with the fear of blushing called task concentration training. And this involves moving the focus of attention away from yourself to what else is going on around you, to become involved in the situation rather than becoming too introspective about how others might be perceiving you in that situation. If you're able then to direct your attention outwards rather than inwards, you're able to engage more effectively with other people. You're more interested in what other people are doing or saying than yourself. And that is a helpful technique for many people with social anxiety disorder, as well as a fear of blushing.
Yeah, I used to use that because I was blushing from a very young age. And so my first thing that I came up with myself was, because I liked sweeties when I was young. So when my maths teacher was talking to me and I was going bright red, I would just try, in my mind, I would try and list all the sweeties that I liked best. Marathon bars, they don't exist anymore. Different types of sweeties, to get my brain to focus on that, rather than thinking, oh my gosh, I'm blushing and what do they think of me? So that's a form of task concentration training.
Yes.
Or noticing colors in the room, or try to listen to what the teacher or the person is saying, or what are they wearing, something that focuses the brain on something else rather than yourself. That's helpful. And what I found really insightful in your paper as well is the point that blushers tend to overestimate or magnify the negative impact of their blushing. They magnify how much they're blushing. Sometimes they're not even blushing that much, but they feel like they are. They feel hot. They magnify what people think of them. They over dramatize, or they over negativize. I'm sure that's not a word. I just made that one up. They over negativize the impacts. What brought you to that understanding, or can you speak to that point a little bit?
Well, in some of the studies that we did, we selected people who were high on a scale of blushing. It was called the blushing propensity scale. And in this scale, people were asked to rate how strongly they blushed across a range of common situations. We found that people that scored highly on this scale, who thought that they blushed strongly in a range of different situations, actually were no different from people who had low scores on that particular scale in how much they blushed in a standard psychological experiment. We asked them to sing children's songs as a form of embarrassment, but of embarrassment that was harmless, and embarrassment that actually was fun. Perhaps more so for the experimenters than for the participants, but nevertheless it was fun. Under those types of conditions, the people who had high scores on the blushing propensity scale thought that they blushed quite strongly, but nevertheless blushed much the same as people with lower scores. And this has been shown across a number of different experiments in a number of different psychology laboratories. It's a robust finding that people who are anxious about blushing, who think that they blush a lot, actually do not blush any more strongly in a physiological sense than people who are less aware of blushing. Having said all of that, though, people who have a fear of blushing, in fact, do tend to blush more strongly than people without that fear in embarrassing situations. So there is some truth to the idea that people who are frightened of blushing, who have a strong fear, actually are strong blushers.
Yes, we get better at it, don't we? Because we practice it so much.
That's right.
The body just gets really good at it. But I think it's so important to make that point that in general, you think you blush as a blusher, you think you blush more than other people. And sometimes you look at other people and you think, how come they can speak up in a meeting, or how come they can walk into a restaurant or ask directions or whatever it happens to be without blushing? But the fact is, probably you do too, or they don't blush any more than you. They just don't care. And then we develop that caring, we develop that fear, and so that makes us better and better at blushing.
There is another point. There is another point there, and that is that other people who we think are noticing that we're blushing actually mostly are completely unaware that we're blushing, that they're more concerned about something else other than whether we're blushing or not. Their focus of attention and of interest is somewhere else. It's really only ourselves who are aware of that internal anxiety and the response that we associate with that feeling of anxiety, that of blushing.
Yeah, and that all that internal talk that we're saying, my goodness, I'm blushing, they're going to think that I'm incapable, or that there's something wrong with me, or that I fancy them. There's all this whole conversation that goes in, and so we create this terrible situation ourselves, and it's sort of a story that runs away with us.
Which might be quite untrue.
Yes. And is there any ideas? Do you have any ideas or any thoughts on what can help people when they recognize themselves doing that?
Well, in cognitive behavioral therapy, one of the important exercises is to find out whether your fears are actually based in reality, or whether the fear is magnified out of proportion to reality. And so clinical psychologists will sometimes ask people who are frightened of blushing to actually check with others and find out what they think about blushing and whether they do notice whether the person who's frightened of blushing actually does blush more than anybody else. And they're often quite surprised by the answers.
Yeah.
That their fears sometimes are out of proportion to reality. That most other people actually don't notice that they're blushing, and if they do notice that they're blushing, don't necessarily put a bad sort of connotation on that. That they're actually sometimes quite charmed by blushing. That blushing, it's a non-threatening signal for other people, basically.
That's right. That's right. And when I see somebody blush, you notice that they blush and you think, oh, they're blushing, and that's as far as it goes. If anything, you feel empathy towards them.
That's right.
That's it. And then you go ahead and you carry on thinking about whatever you were thinking about before. But it's true, we dramatize it so much. And in your paper, sorry, go ahead.
We really only empathize with people if we assume that they're feeling some sort of unpleasant emotion. But blushing can be associated with many forms of emotion, including pleasure.
Yes. And pride and excitement.
So blushing isn't necessary, even if people do notice that you're blushing, it doesn't necessarily imply to the observer that you're experiencing some form of distress in and of itself, although blushing often is associated with other nonverbal cues of discomfort, such as lack of eye contact or of some form of avoidance. So I think that as well as focusing on the types of thoughts that we have and the types of emotions that we link with blushing, we could also think about what other types of behavioral reactions we associate with anxiety, and we can train ourselves, and it's a lot easier to train a behavioral response than it is to train blushing itself. We can teach ourselves to behave in ways that make us feel more comfortable in these anxiety-provoking situations that are productive in terms of meaning that we're able to communicate more effectively with others, or make others feel more comfortable in that social interaction. It's just a thought that I had.
That's a great thought. Do you have any thoughts on what kinds of things we could teach ourselves, for example, to feel comfortable?
Well, one could be to not give in to that strong desire to run away, basically, to avoid. And this running away or avoiding might be literal, or it might be figurative, in that we might stay in the situation but disengage as much as we can. We might avoid looking at other people in case other people catch our eye. We might nod and smile in a way that signals anxiety rather than of interest and of pleasure. So we need to be aware of what we're doing in terms of our non-verbal cues in social situations that indicate either relaxation or one of fear and avoidance, And we can train ourselves to become relaxed in social situations. We can teach ourselves to identify those cues, those behavioral cues, because these are behaviors, they're easier to identify than whether we're blushing or not. You know, we're just saying that people who blush a lot often don't know that they're blushing or not in any particular situation. And when they are blushing, they over magnify how intensely they're blushing. But so it's pretty hard to pick up those cues of blushing itself in any accurate way, but it's far easier to pick up cues of other non-verbal aspects of anxiety. You know, the ones that I was thinking of were, you know, the facial expressions and the eye contact.
Yes.
And bodily posture.
Sorry.
And body posture. You know,
body posture.
You can turn away and you know, try not to not to
try
engage.
not to see you. Yeah. And that posture of sort of curling inwards, shoulders. You know, I'm very tall, and so I was always sort of hunched over, always curled inwards, not open. And I remember, again, a long time ago now, but I remember a friend saying, "Look, Madeline, you're always looking at the ground when you walk. You know, you're always looking down." And I realized, I always look down. I never look in front of me. And I started training myself to look in front of me, because I realized it was an avoidance strategy. It was you know, if I look down, nobody's going to catch my eye. I'm not going to catch anybody's eye. And, you know, I'm going to look busy and I'm going to rush so nobody stops me. And I had to train myself to slow down and look in front of me and notice the trees and notice the buildings. And that makes all the difference. Little things like that, not even in the social situation, even before the social situation, to train yourself. Yeah.
And it means that you're interested in something outside of yourself.
Yes.
Rather than focusing and magnifying and building that anxiety.
Yeah, because it does build, doesn't it? And your studies have shown that, have they, in the physiology? The more you worry about it, the more you're thinking about it, the more you build it, the higher it goes.
Yeah, in fact, we did an interesting little study where we asked people to sing, and then we gave them some feedback on whether they were blushing or not. And this feedback was false feedback, in the sense that we told everybody in one group that they were blushing and everybody in the other group that they weren't blushing.
Right.
And the ones who were told that they were blushing then, you know, quite understandably became concerned about blushing when we asked them to do something else.
Right.
So it is very easy to develop that focus on what might be happening to your physiology.
Yes.
And it doesn't necessarily mean that your fears are being realized, because quite often you're wrong.
Yes. And that's something that can be so hard. It's very rare, but there are, you know, especially in school situations when people are younger, but even in work situations where there's kind of the office bully, where people who blush are teased or ridiculed about their blushing. And then, of course, it makes it worse. And it's a difficult thing to manage. It's difficult to stand up for yourself in those situations, because and those people who call it out are making your blushing worse. So I also do leadership training and so on. I always tell people, if ever you've got a colleague that blushes, pretend nothing is happening. Ignore it. Treat them as if, you know, you just as if it's not happening, and just carry on as normal, because that's the best thing you can do. If you notice somebody's blushing, I believe the best thing you can do is just carry on as normal. Just don't make any sign, and eventually the blushing will go and the person just can carry on. What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, I think that's very good advice, actually. It gives the person time to for that emotional reaction to subside, and these emotions do take they're not instantaneous. They take a couple of seconds to build up, and then they take minutes or more sometimes to dissipate once they've peaked.
Yeah.
You're quite right. If you point out to somebody that they're blushing, it will make them more self-conscious and perhaps make them more anxious about blushing in the future.
Mm-hmm. And is there something you can tell us? So we talked a little bit earlier when we were talking about doing this recording. We talked about now I have to put my glasses on because I always forget how the ETS surgery, the endoscopic thoracic sympathectomy surgery,
Yes.
where they snip a bit of the sympathetic nerve in an attempt to help people stop blushing. And we know that can sometimes cause compensatory sweating. And sometimes it doesn't stop the blushing. I have one person I'm working with now who he had the sympathectomy back in his 20s. Now he's in his 40s. And when he's exercising, he doesn't flush. He sweats a lot, but he doesn't flush. But still in a meeting or something or an embarrassing situation, he still does blush. Have you got some thoughts on how that is or how the sympathectomy works in the first place? And then why is it that it doesn't always stop the blushing?
Well, the sympathetic nerves do supply blood vessels in the face. They can have two effects upon those blood vessels. They can either make the blood vessels constrict, and this is typically in cool conditions. This is around the nose and the ears. They're well supplied with these nerves that make blood vessels constrict. The rest of the face is supplied with sympathetic nerves that make the blood vessels dilate. And these blood vessels dilate actively when they receive messages from sympathetic nerves. When we exercise, so that causes the face to get red when we exercise. And they also contribute to some extent to blushing. That same type of reaction happens where the sympathetic dilator nerves make the blood vessels wider, and more blood can flow through those vessels, and so the skin gets more blood and appears pinker. But there are a few other influences on facial blood vessels. One is through hormones in the bloodstream, and during exercise, but also during anxiety, a hormone called adrenaline is secreted into the bloodstream. This is part of a so-called fight and flight response that happens not only when we exercise, but also when we prepare for exercise. One of the things that prepares us for exercise is strong emotions. Emotions such as anxiety or fear are preparing our body to do something, to run away or to meet the challenge that we're facing. So adrenaline, in fact, helps to prepare the body in a number of different ways for exercise. And one of its effects is to make the blood vessels of the face dilate, presumably as part of that flushing response, which helps us to lose the heat that we generate when we exercise. So even though the nerves to the face itself have been sectioned or cut, there's still that second mechanism where messages get to the blood vessels through the bloodstream. Then there's a third mechanism. In some of our studies, we found that blushing was partly an inflammatory reaction, particularly that blotchy flushing that people sometimes experience in the upper chest. That seems to be part of an inflammatory reaction. We found that an anti-inflammatory cream would help to reduce that component, not the rest of the blushing response, but that inflammatory component when applied to the skin. So it may be that inflammatory reaction is being driven by nerves that are quite independent or separate from the sympathetic nervous system, presumably. That inflammatory reaction involves the nerves of sensation in the face.
I see. So that inflammatory reaction, because some people have had a lot of success with their blushing by changing their nutrition. And could that be one of the reasons that perhaps they are intolerant to certain foods, or some certain foods are causing inflammation internally? Could that be one of the reasons why they get this blotchy, especially here? People tend to get that blotchy. Could that be one of the reasons? It's to do with that third mechanism you were talking about.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea. I'm not sure, but it certainly would be interesting to look into that.
It'd be interesting to look into. I'm hoping that there'll be more and more research into all these interesting things to do with blushing, because one thing's for sure, I've been focusing on this topic now for nearly 2 years, but one thing I've come to realize for sure is that there's no one size fits all. So you talked about a simple fear early on in our conversation, and that's probably one category of people, and it may be a large category of people, but I also think that there are more complex fears, both for myself. You know, I had some traumatic experiences in my childhood, and I know now 50 years later, I'm able to connect those things to my blushing. At the time I didn't know, so there's more complex things as well. And then there's maybe just simple environmental things like intolerances or allergies or other things that are all influencing the blushing response. And it would be lovely if more researchers got involved. Do you think, I mean, I don't know whether you've got a sense of this, but in one book, and now I've forgotten the name of the book, but it's one of the first books about blushing, from a psychologist. He estimated that about 5% of the population suffered from chronic blushing. And his estimation was, as a result, he focused on social anxiety disorder, and then estimated the percentage of people who suffer from social anxiety and disorder. Of those, how many suffer from chronic blushing? And that's how he came up with his 5% estimate. That's what I understand it. Do you have a sense of how many people in the population live with chronic blushing?
Well, it's not living with chronic blushing, it's living with a fear of blushing.
Thank you. Yes, thank you.
I suppose from a clinical psychology perspective, clinical psychologists focus particularly on people who approach them for help. And so this would be people with quite severe social anxiety and people with quite severe fear of blushing. And, you know, as we were saying before, these two different types of fears often do overlap. So it would be reasonable to make an estimate of those with a fear of blushing, which is probably about 50% of those with social anxiety, would be reflected more broadly in the population at large. But we're still talking about a fairly small population with very severe social anxiety or very severe fear of blushing, who actually do approach psychologists for help. So I'm not sure what the prevalence of the fear of blushing would be in the wider population. I don't know that these types of surveys have actually been done.
It would be difficult. I guess it would be difficult because I think many people who suffer from the fear of blushing, they hide it so well. They're not going to admit it because it's associated with shame, and shame is an avoidance emotion. So they're not going to admit it. But it's an interesting thing. And I've just forgotten the question. Oh yes, we were talking about social anxiety. Sometimes people ask me, you know, do I have social anxiety because of my blushing? Did my blushing come first and create the social anxiety? Or did I have the social anxiety, and as a result of the nervousness and the social anxiety, did that cause my blushing? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think they're both two sides of the same coin. It's very difficult to know what comes first. Social anxiety can mean that any anything that we associate with anxiety then becomes part of our fear. And if we associate blushing with anxiety, the social anxiety can then lead on to a fear of blushing. But conversely, people might develop a form of social anxiety because they blush and because they've been ridiculed or bullied because they blush. And so in that sense, the social anxiety would come second to blushing. You know, there are many different paths, I think, to developing a fear of blushing.
Yeah, we humans are complex, aren't we? So
Yeah.
there's no one size fits all. But
Yeah.
thank you so much, Professor Drummond, for those insights. I think if I think back to our conversation and the things that have really touched me and made an impact on me, is especially that what you were saying about those physical perhaps cues that we have in anxiety provoking situation, whether it's looking down or avoiding contact or sort of body posture. Those things are easier to watch and change than the blushing response, which is very subjective. Sometimes you feel hot and you're blushing and you look and, oh, I'm not blushing. And sometimes you don't feel like you're blushing and you look and you, oh, I'm blushing. So being able to change those.
And you can't do anything about it once it's started because it's an automatic response.
Yes. But you can change your habits, your physical habits, and you can begin to change that.
Yes.
I would argue, though, that because I can remember when I first started being able to stop my blushing, I sometimes could nip it in the bud. I could feel it coming. I could feel that wave, and by that task-focused attention, focusing on what they were saying, or try and make myself happy instead of nervous, I like make a joke or something, I'd be able to nip my blushing in the blood. So in the process. So I think sometimes we can have an element of control over it. What do you think about that?
Well, we have an element of control over our emotions. Our thoughts influence the types of emotions that we experience. So we do have control in an indirect way over our physiology. But once that blushing has started, we can't really switch it off in any easy form. Simply by telling ourselves, oh, stop blushing. We can actually make ourselves feel better. In an emotional sense, we can, instead of feeling humiliated or ridiculed or ashamed, you know, there's a whole host of negative emotions that we associate with blushing. Instead of actually following through and accepting that those emotions I'm trying to find the right word, the most appropriate emotion to experience in that situation, we can reconceptualize the situation, we can reframe that situation in a more positive light, in a light probably that most other people are interpreting in that situation itself. That we are, once we get into this trap of being frightened of negative emotions, being frightened of things that we associate with negative emotions, and therefore avoiding anything that might lead to that unpleasant, distressing experience. Once we get into that trap, it's very hard to get out. But it is possible to navigate your way through if you practice skills under more conducive situations, under situations where we can experience some of the triggers that make us feel bad, but then work on responses which negate those emotions that otherwise would lead automatically from those triggers. It is possible to intervene at that stage. So in that sense, you're right, that it is possible to diminish a blushing response, to minimize a blushing response. And it's not so much the blushing response that's important, it's the negative emotions, the distress that we experience, which is important. If we can learn to control that distress through changing the way that we think about what it is that's triggering those distressing emotions, we do get some control over both the emotions and the physiological changes that result from those emotions.
Yeah. So for example, something that people often, the supermarket is often a really good playground for people who have fear of blushing, because there's so many things you can do when you're in the queue, you're at the checkout and you're waiting to check out, you begin to get conscious of yourself, and you're conscious of the people behind you, and you're thinking that person might, the person at the checkout might talk to you, although there's less and less of them now because everything's automated. Or you might have to ask somebody in the shop, ask them how to find a particular product or something. It's a great playground to practice in a relatively safe place. You can choose to go to a supermarket where there's no chance you'll bump into anybody. You can drive out a little while and practice. And I think it is important to give yourself little practice, a playground to practice in, once you decide to focus on overcoming this fear. Because when the fear goes, the blushing goes. It's the combination, and we may still blush sometimes, but it's the pain of it all. So yeah, I see what you're saying about creating those opportunities to address it from a scientific point of view, from a psychological point of view, and help your way through. Because otherwise, if we keep avoiding it, it can really be a shame. There's one lady that I worked with a little while ago. She was already in her 60s, and she had got to the point where she couldn't even invite her adult children and their children, her grandchildren, home to eat for a meal, because she was so worried she would blush in front of them. So that was real social anxiety and real fear of blushing. And it's such a shame that this fear, this prison of fear, like you said, it's a trap. I call it a triangle. It's a trap that we can get into, and it's not so easy to get out of it by yourself.
And I think that's important too, to seek help from others, from professionals who are experienced in helping people with this type of thing.
Thank you so much, Professor Drummond, for this wonderfully interesting and insightful conversation. I do appreciate it. If people wanted to reach out to you, or people wanted to learn more about your work and your research on blushing, where would they be able to find out more?
Well, they can email me. So my email address, being at Murdoch University, is p.drummond@murdoch.edu.au.
Brilliant, thank you. I'll put that in the notes, and that's okay, is it? If somebody has
a
question, that's really kind of you. And thank you again. Thanks so much for this time, for meeting me. I really appreciate it. And are there any other final thoughts or anything that comes to mind before we close this?
No, I think that fear of blushing, as you were saying, is very much underrated out there in the community. But those who have it know that it is a very difficult thing to manage, and that it's hard to actually get on top of it by yourself. You know, I'm really impressed that you're able to do this. But it is something that can be conquered, that it's easier to do this with help from others. We often want to hide if we have something that we're ashamed of, and people often think that being a chronic blusher is shameful, that other people quite rightly will think that they have some sort of impairment or disability because they blush, or because we blush. But talk to your friends. If necessary, talk to an expert who's able to help you to work through this. Regard it not as a physical problem, but as something that is being driven by anxiety, that this is at the basis of this fear of blushing. It's an anxiety about how we're being evaluated, how we're being treated by others, or how we think we're going to be treated by others. And that this is something that's not fixed in stone. This is something that we can work with. There's something that we can do about this problem. And come out there and meet the challenge.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you so much. We can do something about this problem. And often it starts with being able to talk about it, finding some people you trust, and being able to talk about it, because the antidote to shame is being able to speak to the thing you're ashamed about and realizing that, oh, it's okay. It's actually fine. You know? It doesn't matter. And people find it so hard to talk to their friends or their loved ones. Some people haven't told their partners. And the moment they can begin to just open up about it with an expert, with their trusted friends, that's the moment that things begin to get better.
That's right.
Thank you so much, Professor Drummond. I really appreciate the call. It was such an interesting conversation. And also thank you for all the work that you've done on this topic.
Thank you, Madeline.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.